February 20th, 1943. The North African sun burned over the barren ridges of Tunisia, and the German 21st Panzer Division prepared to advance once again toward the American lines near Kasserine Pass. Among them was Oberleutnant Friedrich Weber, commander of a Panzer IV, an experienced officer hardened by years of desert warfare. He had seen the British retreat, had watched Italian units falter, and had learned to read the land like a map of survival. But on this morning, something was different. The battlefield was littered with unfamiliar wreckage. American supply trucks, hastily abandoned after the chaotic retreat, lay broken across the sand. Weber and his crew dismounted to inspect them. Among crates of rations and fuel cans, they found something strange. A long, narrow metal tube with wires, batteries, and a crude sight welded to its frame. It was unlike anything they had seen before. Weber studied it carefully, turning it over in his hands. The weapon was light, barely 6 kilograms, perhaps less. The tube was open at both ends, about 1.5 meters long, with an electrical trigger and small contact wires leading into the rear section. Nearby lay a wooden crate filled with rockets, each about 60 centimeters long, fitted with 4 thin stabilizing fins. The head of each rocket ended in a conical, copper-lined cavity. To a seasoned panzer commander, it seemed absurd. A shoulder-fired rocket? Infantry carrying their own anti-tank weapon? The idea sounded like desperation. Yet curiosity won over skepticism. Weber ordered one of his engineers to bring a captured American helmet, and they improvised a field test. From a safe distance, they fired the strange weapon at the helmet placed on a rock. The rocket hissed out of the tube with a burst of smoke, struck the helmet, and exploded. The blast left a clean hole, not a shatter. Weber approached the impact and stared. The hole was perfectly round, edges melted smooth, steel pushed outward. This was no simple explosive. It was a shaped charge. For a few seconds, the desert fell silent. Then, Weber said quietly, "If this can do that to a helmet, what would it do to a tank?" He didn't yet know that what he held was called the M1 Bazooka, America's secret infantry anti-tank weapon. Developed only months earlier, the bazooka was crude but revolutionary. It combined 2 simple ideas: a solid fuel rocket and a hollow charge warhead. The rocket gave range. The shaped charge gave penetration. Together, they gave an ordinary soldier the power to destroy a tank. Until that moment, tanks ruled the battlefield. They were the predators of modern war, armored, armed, and feared. Infantry, without artillery, were prey. But in Weber's hands lay the prototype of a new age, one where a man on foot could stand against steel and fire. That discovery spread quickly. Captured bazookas were rushed to German field engineers for analysis. Reports reached Berlin within days. The Ordnance Department in Magdeburg disassembled the weapon and studied its design. The findings shocked them. The American weapon was cheap, simple, and effective. A lightweight steel tube, an electrical firing circuit powered by dry batteries, and a shaped charge warhead capable of penetrating up to 80 millimeters of armor. It could be built from materials any medium factory could produce. In engineering terms, it was primitive, but it worked. And that was the danger. The German engineers recognized the potential immediately. Within weeks, they began development of their own version. It would become the Panzerschreck, or Tank Terror, a heavier and more refined adaptation, firing an 88 millimeter rocket. Yet that was still months away. For now, the bazooka was an American advantage, though few on the Allied side yet understood its full power. The early bazooka, designated M1, fired the M6 rocket, its warhead fitted with a copper cone that focused the explosive force into a narrow jet, capable of melting through armor like butter. The physics behind it had been discovered years earlier by German scientists. Ironically enough, Munro and Neumann effects studied and documented, but it was the Americans who first turned theory into a mass-producible weapon. Weber's field report that day described the weapon as dangerous if properly used, but his superior officers dismissed it as a curiosity. They had confidence in the superiority of German armor. The Panzer IV, with its 50 to 80 millimeters of frontal armor, could shrug off most Allied guns. The new American M3 and M4 tanks were undergunned, poorly coordinated, and inexperienced. In the High Command's view, no shoulder-fired toy would change that balance. They were wrong. Only weeks later, the bazooka appeared again, this time in combat. At Sidi Bou Zid, American infantry fired the weapon against advancing German half-tracks. The first shots missed, the rockets spiraling off into the desert. But by the time of Kasserine Pass, crews had learned. Short ranges, aimed shots, side armor. A well-placed rocket could disable a tank or frighten its crew into retreat. In the post-battle analysis, German officers noticed something unsettling. Several tanks had been abandoned intact. No penetrations, no fire. The crews had fled after hearing or seeing rockets fired at them. The psychological effect was immediate. The myth of invincibility, the idea that a tank could crush anything in its path, had been broken by a 6-kilogram tube. From a purely tactical perspective, the bazooka's early flaws were obvious. Its range was short, barely 100 yards. Its accuracy depended on calm nerves and open ground. The rockets were sensitive to moisture. The batteries often failed in desert heat. Yet every weapon evolves through necessity, and the bazooka evolved fast. Within months, the Americans refined it. The M1A1 model replaced fragile wiring with a more reliable trigger. And by mid-1943, production numbers were climbing into the tens of thousands. The weapon's lightness meant it could be carried by every squad. Its simplicity meant it could be used with minimal training. And its effect on morale, both for those who fired it and those who faced it, was immense. For the first time, American infantry could fight tanks on equal terms. The desert became a laboratory for modern warfare. The tank had dominated for years through shock and speed, but now a new balance was forming. A single soldier could halt a column, ambush a convoy, or hold a crossroads. Friedrich Weber would later write in his diary that Tunisia marked the moment when machines began to fear men. He could not have known that what started as a strange find in the sand would within 2 years reshape the doctrines of every army in the world. The bazooka had begun its quiet revolution, not through perfection, but through possibility. By March 1943, the Desert War had entered its final, brutal phase. The German Afrika Korps, once an unstoppable force under Rommel, now faced an enemy learning faster than ever before. The Americans, young, inexperienced, often derided as amateurs by both ally and foe, were adapting. Their machines weren't the best, but their factories never slept. Their tactics weren't flawless, but they improved with every defeat. And now, in their hands, they carried a weapon that would begin to reshape the very psychology of armored warfare, the bazooka. Oberleutnant Friedrich Weber noticed the change firsthand. At the Battle of Macknassy, his Panzer IV company rolled forward with confidence. The terrain was familiar, open desert, broken by low ridges and scrub. Perfect tank country. But this time, the enemy didn't scatter as before. Instead, small American squads held their ground. They waited, calm, invisible among the rocks, until the panzers drew close. Then the first rockets streaked out of the dust. A flash, a hiss, a burst of smoke. One rocket struck the side of a Panzer III, penetrating, igniting, and killing the crew inside. Another shot hit the track of Weber's lead tank, disabling it instantly. For the first time, the advance faltered, not because of artillery or air attack, but because of men on foot. Weber recalled later that it wasn't just the physical damage that changed everything. It was the fear. Every rock, every patch of scrub, every ruined wall could now conceal death. The tank commanders began to hesitate, scanning the terrain with binoculars, waiting for telltale trails of smoke. Speed, the essence of German doctrine, evaporated. This was the true genius of the bazooka. Not its firepower, but its influence. It disrupted the rhythm of mechanized warfare. It forced the hunter to become the hunted. By April 1943, German intelligence had fully realized the threat. Captured bazookas were dissected in Berlin and at the Kummersdorf testing ground. Engineers were astonished at its simplicity. No complex optics, no expensive materials, no elaborate training manuals. Just a tube, a rocket, and a soldier. The entire launcher could be built in a single shift by a small factory. The technical report filed that spring described it in typically dry German precision. American rocket launcher, infantry type, weight, 6 kilograms. Penetration, 80 millimeters of armor at 100 meters. Production requirements, minimal. Material cost, negligible. A functional weapon for mass use. In those few lines lay the future of modern warfare. For a nation like Germany, whose military culture prized engineering perfection, the bazooka was an insult to tradition. It was inelegant, unsophisticated, even ugly. But it worked, and that made it terrifying. The German response was immediate. By mid-1943, they began work on a scaled-up version, the Raketen Panzerbuchse 43, later known to Allied soldiers as the Panzerschreck, the tanks. It was a bigger, heavier, more powerful cousin to the American design, firing an 88-millimeter rocket that could penetrate over 160 millimeters of armor, twice the bazooka's capability. On paper, it was superior in every way. In reality, it revealed everything wrong with the German approach to war. The Panzerschreck weighed almost twice as much, nearly 12 kilograms with its blast shield. Its backblast was so violent that early users had to wear gas masks to avoid inhaling burning propellant. It required better materials, more precision machining, and stricter quality control. While the bazooka could be built in a basic workshop, the Panzerschreck demanded industrial craftsmanship that Germany by 1944 could barely afford. Production never kept pace with demand. From 1943 to 1945, Germany produced just under 290,000 Panzerschrecks. In the same period, America produced nearly 500,000 bazookas and more than 15 million rockets. But the difference wasn't only in numbers, it was in doctrine. The Americans integrated the bazooka at the squad level. Every infantry unit had multiple launchers. Every platoon trained to coordinate them with rifles and machine guns. The bazooka became part of the soldier's identity. It gave him confidence, independence, and the ability to face armor head-on. The Germans, by contrast, treated the Panzerschreck as a specialist's tool. Issued sparingly, often at the company level, it remained rare where it mattered most, among the ordinary infantry. This was the same mistake they had made with the Tiger tank, over-engineering excellence instead of mass-producing adequacy. Weber saw the results of this difference firsthand in 1944. After surviving the North African campaign, he was redeployed to France to command a panzer company defending the Cotentin Peninsula during the Allied invasion. There, in the bocage country of Normandy, the battlefield changed again. The hedgerows turned every field into a fortress. Narrow lanes, thick brush, stone walls. Perfect ground for ambush. Terrible ground for tanks. When the panzers advanced, American bazooka teams were waiting, hidden in ditches, behind walls, beneath foliage. Every hedge became a killing field. Weber's unit was ordered to counterattack near St. Lo in July 1944. 14 tanks rolled forward through the maze of hedgerows. Within 4 hours, they advanced less than half a kilometer. 2 tanks destroyed, 3 more crippled by rockets. Weber's own vehicle took a glancing hit that scorched the armor and wounded his gunner. His driver froze, terrified to move forward. The attack was called off. In his later debriefing, Weber wrote, "Every shadow may hold a man with a rocket. Every step forward feels like walking into a trap. The tank, once the master of battle, now moves only by permission of the infantry." By that summer, the Wehrmacht armored doctrine was collapsing under the weight of industrial reality. Tanks were no longer the decisive weapon. They were prey to swarms of lightly armed men carrying $25 tubes of steel. The fear that once belonged to the infantry had reversed. Inside the tank, men now flinched at every flash of smoke. The psychological shift was irreversible. The bazooka didn't just change tactics, it changed the mindset of war. No longer could any army rely solely on armored dominance. The balance had shifted to the individual soldier, the man who could carry destruction on his shoulder and strike from concealment. It was the beginning of the end for traditional armored warfare as Germany had known it. By the autumn of 1944, as the Allies pushed east toward the Rhine, Weber's company, once proud and confident, was reduced to scattered remnants. Tanks burned on roadsides. Fuel convoys were annihilated from the air. Infantry ambushes cut them to pieces. When the Battle of the Bulge began that winter, the last great gamble of the Reich, he knew it was already over. And at the center of that collapse stood one symbol of industrial democracy's triumph over militarized perfectionism: the cheap, ugly, unstoppable bazooka. By late 1944, the thunder of German armor that once shook Europe had become a shadow of itself. The panzers still looked formidable, their steel silhouettes cutting across frozen landscapes, their long barrels promising destruction. But the confidence that powered them was gone. Inside the tanks, the crews no longer felt invincible. Friedrich Weber knew this too well. He had been fighting since 1941, from the sands of Africa to the hedgerows of France, and by winter 1944, he was a survivor, not a believer. The tanks around him were newer. Panzer Gs, sleek, deadly, powerful. But the men inside were young, untested, and afraid. Every one of them had seen or heard stories of panzers destroyed by rockets fired from shadows. Every one of them knew that bravery could not stop shaped charges. The German High Command called it Wacht am Rhein, the Watch on the Rhine. To the world, it would be remembered as the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last desperate attempt to split the Allied front, capture Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. In theory, it was audacious. In reality, it was suicide. Fuel shortages crippled mobility before the attack even began. Air superiority was lost the moment the clouds cleared. But most devastating of all, German armor once again faced the same enemy that had haunted it since Kasserine, the bazooka. At Bastogne, surrounded American paratroopers held their ground under constant assault. German tanks tried to push through narrow streets and broken buildings, but every alley became a death trap. American infantry crouched in basements, on rooftops, behind wreckage. They fired at point-blank range. Bazooka flashes illuminated the snow. The Americans didn't have the luxury of retreat. They didn't need it. They had the weapon that equalized everything. Reports from Bastogne tell the same story again and again. Tanks halted, crews bailing out, others reversing in panic, afraid to move closer. For every tank destroyed, several more were abandoned simply because they entered a zone the defenders controlled with bazookas. At Elsenborn Ridge, where the terrain favored the defense, entire German columns were stopped cold. Bazooka teams, working in pairs, hit tanks from the sides, while riflemen distracted from the front. At St. Vith, combat engineers, men trained to build bridges, not fight tanks, used bazookas to repel advancing armor and delay the German timetable for days. When German commanders later reviewed the battle, they found a grim statistic. In multiple engagements, bazookas accounted for nearly 1 in 10 tank. But the figure didn't tell the whole story. Far more tanks were neutralized, not destroyed, abandoned or delayed. The bazooka's real effect was not destruction. It was paralysis. For the first time since 1939, the tank was no longer the apex predator of the battlefield. Even the fearsome Tiger and Panther tanks, symbols of German dominance, could not move confidently in terrain where every soldier might be carrying a weapon capable of killing them. Weber saw it himself in the Ardennes. His company, what was left of it, moved through the forests near Stavelot under a pale winter sky. The snow muffled sound, but every so often came the whoosh of a rocket, the crack of impact, the muffled scream of a crew caught inside their burning steel coffin. By the third day, Weber stopped trusting his instincts. He no longer looked for enemy tanks or artillery. He looked for movement in the trees. A glint of metal, a puff of smoke, the signs of a bazooka team. When the offensive finally collapsed, Weber's company was destroyed. Only 3 of his original 14 tanks remained operational. The rest were either knocked out or abandoned due to lack of fuel. By April 1945, he surrendered to American forces near Kassel. In his interrogation, when asked what weapon had most affected German tactics, Weber didn't mention Allied tanks, aircraft, or artillery. He simply said the American rocket launcher made infantry dangerous to armor. After 1943, we could no longer advance without fear. He wasn't alone in that belief. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring later admitted that infantry anti-tank weapons, particularly the bazooka, had negated the very essence of blitzkrieg. General Heinz Guderian, architect of German armored doctrine, acknowledged that proliferation of such weapons had ended the era of independent tank warfare. This was the quiet revolution few historians noticed. The bazooka had not just changed tactics, it had rewritten military philosophy. It proved that quantity, simplicity, and accessibility could defeat technical superiority. It proved that industrial might could substitute for complexity. And it proved that democracy, with its mass production and collective approach, could create weapons that reflected its own values, practical, scalable, and designed for the common soldier. The mathematics of war spoke plainly. By 1945, America had produced 476,000 bazookas and more than 15 million rockets. Each launcher cost roughly $25. Each rocket less than $2. A German Panzer IV cost $41,000. A Panther, $47,000. A Tiger, $100,000. For the price of a single Tiger, the U.S. could arm 4,000 men with bazookas and 10,000 rockets. That wasn't just economics. It was strategy in numerical form. For every German tank built, America created an army of hunters. Even if the bazooka's hit rate was only 40% at 100 yards, the sheer number of weapons meant that somewhere, at some time, one would find its mark. The Germans fought to build the perfect tank. The Americans built enough imperfect weapons to make perfection irrelevant. In the European theater, only about 12% of German tank losses were directly attributed to bazookas, but that figure hides their true influence. For every destroyed tank, there were several more immobilized or abandoned due to fear of ambush. Crews left vehicles intact, engines running, and fled into the woods rather than face the unseen rocket. The bazooka had done something even artillery and air power couldn't. It had stripped armor of its aura. When the war ended, the weapon's legacy was already secure. The principles it proved, man-portable anti-tank firepower, infantry independence, and mass-producible simplicity, became foundational to every army in the modern world. From the RPG-7 in the Soviet Union to the Carl Gustaf, the Javelin, and the AT-4, every modern launcher traces its lineage back to that first crude American tube. The concept never died, it simply evolved. Weber, in his post-war reflections, admitted something remarkable. He said that what truly defeated Germany wasn't Allied tanks or bombers or generals. It was the realization that every enemy soldier could destroy his tank. The fear was constant, invisible, and cumulative. It broke discipline. It slowed movement. It ended the era of blitzkrieg. The bazooka had done what no weapon before it could do. It made the ordinary soldier equal to the machine. In the end, the war that began with Germany's technological superiority ended with America's industrial simplicity. And in that simplicity lay a profound truth of modern conflict, that the future belongs not to the perfect weapon, but to the weapon that everyone can use. The bazooka did not win through brilliance or beauty. It won because it was good enough. It won because it was everywhere. And it reminded the world that sometimes victory belongs not to the strongest, but to the most adaptable. When World War II ended in 1945, the battlefields of Europe were littered with the burnt-out carcasses of tanks, steel husks that once symbolized invincibility. But among the wreckage lay something more subtle and revolutionary, the realization that one man with the right weapon could change the balance of power on the battlefield. The American bazooka had proven it beyond doubt, and in doing so, it forced every major military power on Earth to rethink what power really meant. In the first years of peace, engineers and generals alike began dissecting the lessons of the bazooka. The U.S. Army's post-war reports used calm, bureaucratic language, but behind those words lay something profound. Infantry, equipped with rocket launchers, demonstrated decisive potential against armored targets when properly trained and positioned. That potential would evolve into doctrine. By 1947, as Cold War tensions emerged, the American military faced a new question. What if the next war came not from the ruins of Europe, but from the rising industrial power of the Soviet Union? The Red Army fielded thousands of T-34s and newer designs like the T-54, tanks faster, stronger, and more numerous than anything the Wehrmacht had built. The U.S. needed a way to counter them without bankrupting itself. The answer wasn't bigger tanks. It was better bazookas. Engineers at the U.S. Army Ordnance Department began developing the M20 Super Bazooka, a 3.5-inch launcher that doubled the range and penetration of the wartime M1. It could pierce 11 inches of armor, enough to destroy any Soviet tank of its era. When the Korean War erupted in 1950, this new weapon met its trial by fire. In the early months of the war, North Korean T-34s rolled south almost unopposed. The first American troops sent to Korea carried leftover M9 bazookas from 1945, too weak to penetrate the T-34's sloped armor. The result was disaster. But within months, U.S. forces received the new 3.5-inch M20. When those launchers arrived, the balance shifted almost overnight. The T-34s that once terrorized UN troops began exploding on the roads of Seoul and along the Naktong River. Infantry units that had been forced to retreat days earlier were now ambushing tanks at will. The bazooka had evolved, and once again, it was rewriting the rules of war. The lesson was undeniable. Mobility and affordability beat. Generals learned that the key wasn't to field the biggest gun, but to give the smallest unit the means to defend itself. As America refined its design, the rest of the world took notice. In the Soviet Union, captured bazookas from Europe and Korea were reverse-engineered. In 1949, Soviet designers produced their own man-portable rocket launcher, the RPG-2, later perfected into the RPG-7. Simple, rugged, and cheap, it became the most widely used anti-tank weapon in history. From the jungles of Vietnam to the mountains of Afghanistan, the concept the U.S. had created now came back to face it. The very idea born in an American workshop, one man with a tube capable of destroying armor, had gone global. It was poetic and ironic. The same principle that gave democracy its strength now armed revolutionaries and insurgents. By the 1960s, American soldiers found themselves facing the mirror image of their own invention. Viet Cong fighters carried RPG-2s and later RPG-7s, descendants of the bazooka, cheap and lethal. Helicopters and armored personnel carriers that once dominated the battlefield suddenly became vulnerable. The psychological power of the anti-tank weapon had evolved into a political weapon as well. Every soldier knew that even a poorly trained guerrilla could take out a $1 million machine. The bazooka's spirit had transcended its form. It was no longer just a weapon, it was an idea, decentralized lethality. During the Cold War, NATO and Warsaw Pact forces both embraced this philosophy. Sweden developed the Carl Gustaf recoilless rifle, Britain the LAW-80, and the US the M72 LAW, each iteration lighter, safer, and more efficient. By the 1980s, technology had advanced to guided munitions like the FGM-148 Javelin, which allowed soldiers to destroy tanks from 2 kilometers away with pinpoint accuracy. Yet despite all the upgrades, infrared guidance, tandem warheads, fire and forget systems, the essence remained unchanged. The spirit of the bazooka was alive in every one of them. The core principle was universal and eternal. Every soldier must have the means to destroy a tank. But beyond the technology, the bazooka changed something deeper. It reshaped the moral and psychological balance of warfare. For centuries, the armored knight, the tank, the warship, all represented the elite tools of power. They were symbols of state authority and industrial might. The bazooka democratized destruction. It handed that power to the common soldier. It was no longer about who had the largest machine. It was about who could adapt faster, think smarter, and fight with what they had. That was the quiet revolution. The bazooka began in 1942. It didn't just destroy tanks. It destroyed hierarchy. It made every soldier matter. Even in the 21st century, its echo remains. In Ukraine, in Iraq, in Syria, modern soldiers and resistance fighters, use updated descendants of the bazooka to challenge armored forces far more advanced than those of World War II. From the Javelin to the NLAW, from RPGs to AT-4s, the lesson remains, carved in steel and smoke. No tank, no matter how advanced, can dominate if the infantry standing in its path can fight back. The bazooka changed warfare, not through brilliance or complexity, but through belief. It proved that ingenuity could outmatch intimidation. It taught the world that power doesn't always roar from engines and treads. Sometimes it hums quietly in the hands of a soldier, waiting for the moment to strike. When historians measure the legacy of World War II, they often speak of the atom bomb, radar, or the jet engine. But in the shadows of those grand inventions stands a simple, overlooked tube, a weapon born in haste, used by millions, and remembered by few. It didn't end the war in a single blast. It didn't destroy cities. But it changed how every war since has been fought. The bazooka proved that progress in warfare doesn't always come from bigger weapons, but from smarter ideas. It reminded the world that in the hands of a free people, even the simplest weapon could change history. And it left us with a truth that echoes to this day. Democracy armed with innovation can defeat tyranny armed with perfection. The bazooka was more than a weapon. It was an idea that gave power to the many and fear to the few. In the end, the story of the bazooka isn't just about a weapon. It's about adaptation. The moment when ordinary soldiers gained the power to stop the unstoppable. It marked the turning point where industrial strength, ingenuity, and courage combined to rewrite the rules of war. A simple steel tube, costing less than a soldier's boots, reshaped the fate of nations and proved that in modern warfare, innovation matters more than intimidation, because sometimes history isn't changed by the biggest guns, but by the smartest ideas. If you found this story as compelling as we did, subscribe for more untold histories of World War II, where strategy, technology, and human endurance collide. And before you go, watch our next feature, The Fall of the Tiger, how Germany's greatest tank became its greatest burden. Your journey through the hidden front lines of World War II continues there.